Certified letter arrived on a Tuesday, and I stood at my kitchen counter reading it 3 times before my hands stopped shaking enough to set it down. My daughter-in-law was suing me for financial elder abuse. She claimed I had manipulated my son into transferring $340,000 out of their joint account into accounts she didn't know about. The dates listed ran from last January through April. 14 separate transactions, she said. A systematic pattern of coercion and fraud. The problem was simple. I'd had a massive stroke on December 28th and spent all of January through late April at Mercy General Hospital in Louisville, followed by 6 weeks at a rehabilitation center on the east side. I hadn't touched a computer. I hadn't held a pen long enough to sign my name until March. For the first 11 weeks, I couldn't form a complete sentence. My nephew stood in my living room, and old paving room, and old bank was fitter 31 years with the same union local in Jefferson County, Kentucky. I have never been sued in my life. I've never even had a parking ticket dismissed late. The worst legal trouble I've ever been in was a boundary dispute with a neighbor over a fence line. And we settled that over coffee and a handshake. Reading Shelby's name on that lawsuit felt like reading a stranger's name. She'd been married to my son Cody, who I'd coached through Little League and driven to every single one of his high school wrestling matches for 4 years. I'd watched them exchange vows at a vineyard outside Lexington. I danced with her mother at the reception. I thought we were family. I called my son immediately. He didn't pick up. I called 3 more times that afternoon. Nothing. That night, my daughter Ree drove her from Jefferson down after I texted her. She sat across from me at that same kitchen counter and read the lawsuit from first page to last without saying a word. "Dad," she said finally, "you were in the hospital." "I know that." "You were in the ICU for 6 weeks." "I know that too." She set the papers down carefully, like they might bite her. "Does Cody know she filed this?" I didn't have an answer for that. I still don't know, to this day, exactly what my son knew and when he knew it. The lawsuit demanded $340,000 in restitution plus damages, citing emotional distress and what her attorney called a prolonged pattern of psychological manipulation. She wanted a restraining order preventing me from contacting Cody or their 2 kids, my grandchildren, 8-year-old twins named Macy and Owen. She had filed in family court in Louisville, and the hearing date was 11 weeks out. I want to explain what it feels like to be accused of something you couldn't have done. It's not anger, not at first. It's something quieter and more disorienting than anger. It's the feeling of standing in a room you've lived in your whole life and suddenly not recognizing the walls. Everything you thought was solid turns conditioned. You start wondering if there's something wrong with your own memory, even though you know there isn't. I had spent 4 months relearning how to walk with a cane. I had spent 6 weeks relearning how to form words clearly enough for strangers to understand me. And now, I was going to spend whatever strength I had left fighting a lawsuit that accused me of crimes committed while I was unconscious. I found an attorney through a friend from the union, a woman named Diane Howell who had spent 20 years in civil litigation and didn't waste words. I read her the allegations over the phone. She asked me how long I'd been hospitalized. "Admitted December 28th, I said. "Transferred to Brookside Rehab May 9th. Released home June 23rd. There was a pause. "Do you still have your discharge paperwork?" "I have everything." "Then this case gets dismissed," she said. "You have an alibi that's bulletproof by definition. You are monitored around the clock. We get your records, we show them to a judge, this ends in a conference room." I wanted to believe her. But Shelby's attorney had included bank statements in the lawsuit filing, and I'd spent 2 evenings going through them with a magnifying glass. The account numbers were real. They belonged to accounts my son and daughter-in-law held jointly at a credit union in Louisville. The transfers were documented with routing numbers, dates, and memo lines. And the transfers listed as coming from an outside party were attributed to an account number I didn't recognize at all. Someone had used an account number that didn't belong to me to initiate transfers. And somehow, that account number was being connected to my name. I called Diane the next morning and told her. Another pause, longer this time. "That changes things slightly," she said. "Not the outcome, you still have the medical records, but it means someone went to more effort than a simple misidentification. We need to find out whose account that actually is and how your name got attached to it." My son finally called back on a Thursday evening, 9 days after the lawsuit arrived. The conversation lasted 4 minutes. He sounded tired in a way I didn't recognize. A flatness in his voice like something had been pressed out of him. "She says she has proof, Dad." "Cody, I was in the hospital. I know you were in the hospital. Then you know I couldn't have done this. Another silence. The bank has documents with your name on them. Account authorizations. Signed. I didn't sign anything. I couldn't hold a pen until March, asked my occupational therapist. He didn't say anything for a long moment. Then, I need some time to sort this out. He hung up. I sat in my kitchen in the dark for a while after that. What I didn't say to him because I couldn't find the words fast enough was that the signed documents he mentioned were impossible. My right hand had been affected by the stroke. Nerve damage running from my shoulder to my fingers on the dominant side. My signature from that period looked nothing like my actual signature. I have the therapy progress notes to prove it. Anything signed in my name between late December and at least February would be visibly, demonstrably wrong. Diane subpoenaed my full medical records from Mercy General the following week. The file ran to 389 pages. Admission on December 28 following emergency services transport. Hemorrhagic stroke, right hemisphere, 11 days in the neurological ICU. Transfer to a step-down unit January 9. Documented right side motor impairment through at least March 4th when therapy notes recorded my first functional grip on a pen. I hadn't been discharged from inpatient rehab until June. She also subpoenaed my phone records. There had been no outgoing calls from my number to any financial institution during the period in question. The calls that appeared on the bank's records. Conversations allegedly between me and a customer service representative at the credit union, verifying account changes, hadn't come from my phone. Diane said the same thing my daughter had said 3 weeks earlier, in slightly different words. Someone spoofed your number. Made calls look like they originated from you. That's actually a federal offense, separate from everything else here. By that point, Ray had started doing something I hadn't asked her to do. She'd started quietly looking into Shelby's life before Cody. Nothing invasive, she said. Just paying attention to things she'd always wondered about, but never looked at closely. Shelby had come into Cody's life fast. They'd met at a gym, been engaged within 7 months, married within a year. Ray had always thought it moved quickly but told herself that was just how some people were. What Ray found didn't look like anything at first. But she called me one Sunday morning with something specific in her voice. Dad, before she met Cody, she was married. I knew that. It came up once. She said it ended amicably. It ended in court. Her first husband, I found a public records filing, she used his last name on it. There was a civil dispute. He was contesting the division of a joint account. Said money had been moved without his authorization. I sat down. How much? The filing doesn't have the full amount. But the case was settled out of court. He agreed to drop it. When was this? 6 years ago. She was living in Nashville then. I sent that information to Diane immediately. She went quiet in the way she did when she was thinking through something complicated. And then she said she wanted to bring in someone else. A forensic accountant she'd worked with before. A man named Bert Calloway who had spent years doing financial fraud investigations for insurance companies before going independent. Bert met with me at a diner near his office in the Highlands neighborhood, a quiet booth in the back. He was maybe 50, wore reading glasses on a chain, and spoke in the careful, measured way of someone who had learned to say exactly what he could prove and nothing more. I walked him through everything. The lawsuit, the account numbers, the spoofed calls, the signed documents my son said the bank had on file, Shelby's previous civil dispute in Nashville. He studied the bank statements Diane had forwarded. He pulled out a notepad and wrote down the mystery account number, the one attributed to my name that I'd never seen before. Give me a few days, he said. 3 days later, he called. That account was opened 14 months ago at a credit union branch in Clarksville, Indiana, he said. Across the river. The name on the account is Louis D. Briggs. My full legal name is Louis Thomas Briggs. The social security number is off by 2 digits, Bert said. Different date of birth, different address. But close enough to pass a casual review, especially at a branch that doesn't cross-reference federal databases for every new account. Someone had built a financial ghost, a version of me with a slightly wrong social security number and a fabricated address at a credit union in a different state, close enough to real that a bank employee reviewing paperwork wouldn't catch it without running a hard inquiry. I asked Bert how difficult that would be to set up. Not as difficult as it should be, he said. You'd need access to some of the real person's identifying information. Name, rough date of birth, enough to make the documentation look plausible. And you'd need someone willing to do it, who knew what they were doing. How would they have gotten my identifying information? Were you ever in a situation where you shared personal financial documents with her? Tax returns, social security statements, anything like that? I thought about it. 3 years ago, when Cody and Shelby were trying to buy their house, I had co-signed on the mortgage. The lender had required full documentation from all parties. I had handed over everything. Tax returns going back 5 years, my social security statement, my pension documentation, my bank account information. I had handed Shelby's household the exact information needed to build a ghost account in my name. When I told Ray, she didn't say anything for a long time. Then she planned this. I didn't answer because I was still working out the math in my head. The stroke had happened in late December. Shelby had filed the lawsuit in May. If she'd been sitting on my identifying information since the mortgage application 3 years ago, she'd had time to build the framework slowly, carefully, without rushing anything. And my stroke, something she couldn't have planned, had given her the perfect window. I was incapacitated. I couldn't monitor my own accounts. I couldn't receive certified mail. I couldn't defend myself. She had seen an opportunity and used it. Diane filed her response to the lawsuit 2 weeks later. Medical records establishing my hospitalization during the entirety of the period in question. Phone records showing no contact between my number and any financial institution. Expert documentation from Bert about the fraudulent account opened in my name with incorrect identifying information. A separate filing flagging the discrepancies to the Financial Crimes Unit of the Kentucky Attorney General's office. Shelby's attorney went quiet for 10 days. Then she requested a meeting. We met in a conference room at Diane's office downtown. Shelby came with her attorney, a man named Ashworth, who had the practiced calm of someone who'd been in plenty of rooms like this one. My son was not there. I had not seen my son in person since before my stroke. Diane walked through the documentation systematically. Medical records, phone records, the forensic account analysis showing the ghost account with the transposed social security number and fabricated address, the public filing from Nashville 6 years earlier. Shelby looked at the table in front of her throughout most of it. Once, she looked up and her eyes met mine, and I tried to find something in them I recognized. The woman who had sat at my Thanksgiving table, who had sent me a card when I got out of rehab with a note that said, "We're so glad you're home," but it wasn't there. When Diane finished, Ashworth asked for a recess. They stepped into the hallway. They were out there for 20 minutes. When they came back, Ashworth said his client was prepared to withdraw the lawsuit voluntarily. He said there had been irregularities in the documentation that raised questions about the origin of the account activity, and that his client did not wish to proceed given those irregularities. Diane said that was fine, and that we would be filing a separate complaint with law enforcement regarding the fraudulent account and the spoofed phone calls. Ashworth said his client understood. Shelby didn't say anything. She stood up, gathered her bag, and walked out without looking at me again. What came after that took months to unfold, the way these things always do when courts and law enforcement are involved. The Kentucky Attorney General's Financial Crimes Office opened an investigation. The credit union in Clarksville, Indiana, cooperated fully, handing over the account opening documentation, which included a photocopy of an ID that did not match any driver's license ever issued to me in any state. Handwriting analysis on the signed account documents confirmed they didn't match my signature from any period in my recorded history, including samples from before the stroke when my hand worked correctly. What the investigation found eventually was that Shelby had done this before. Not identically. People who do this kind of thing rarely repeat the exact same method, but the pattern was recognizable. Her first husband in Nashville had experienced something structurally similar. Money moved from accounts using documentation that looked legitimate, a civil dispute filed by the party being defrauded, a settlement that allowed her to walk away without criminal exposure. The first husband had settled because he'd been embarrassed, because the documentation had looked real enough that he'd half-doubted himself, because litigation is expensive and exhausting and he'd wanted it to be over. She had counted on the same thing happening with me. What she hadn't counted on was that I'd spent 31 years in a union learning to keep paperwork. That I had Diane. That I had Ray, who had always paid attention to things that didn't add up. And that I had 4 months of ironclad medical records produced by a hospital that documented every hour of my incapacitation with the thoroughness of an institution that gets sued if it doesn't. The criminal charges came down in early fall: wire fraud, identity theft, fraudulent financial account creation. The financial crimes prosecutor told Diane there was a strong case and that they expected to proceed. My son called me the night after the charges were filed. He sounded different from the last time, less flat, more like himself, though himself had clearly been through something I hadn't fully witnessed. "I didn't know," he said. "Dad, I need you to know I didn't know." I know you didn't know. The documents she showed me looked real. She had an explanation for everything. She said you'd been hiding money from the family for years, that the stroke had been brought on partly by the stress of what you'd been doing. A pause. I wanted to believe her. That's the part I can't forgive myself for. I thought about that for a long time before I answered him. She knew how to use a son's doubts about his father. I said finally, that's not a character flaw in you. That's a skill she developed over years. We talked for a long time that night. About Macy and Owen, who were confused and didn't fully understand what was happening. About what the next months would look like. About the fact that his marriage was over in every practical sense, even if the divorce hadn't been filed yet. Cody drove out to see me the following weekend. First time I'd seen him since before the hospital. He looked older. We sat on my back porch and didn't talk about any of it for the first hour. Just drank coffee and watched the yard. Then he said he was sorry. And I said there was nothing to be sorry for. And we both knew that wasn't entirely true and also wasn't entirely false. And we let it sit there between us, the way fathers and sons let things sit when words aren't quite big enough. The lawsuit was formally withdrawn in September. The criminal case proceeded into the following year. I'm not going to describe the outcome in detail here because it's still making its way through the system, and I've learned to be careful about what I say before courts have their say. What I will say is this. I spent 4 months unable to speak clearly, unable to walk without assistance, unable to hold a pen. And during those same 4 months, someone used my name, my social security number, my financial identity to construct a fraud that was designed to outlast my incapacitation and leave me either financially destroyed or criminally liable, whichever came first. The thing that saved me was documentation. Not my memory, not my word, not my character. Paper, nursing logs, discharge summaries, physical therapy progress notes that recorded hour by hour the exact state of my motor function on any given date. A phone carrier's records, a forensic accountant who knew how to find a 2-digit transposition in a social security number. I've spent a lot of time since then thinking about what I would say to someone who asks how a person protects themselves from something like this. The honest answer is that you mostly can't, not while it's happening. Fraud is designed to work in the dark. It works because it exploits the gap between what looks true and what is true, and closing that gap takes time and resources most people don't have ready to go. What you can do is document your own life with more intention than you think you need to. Keep records, save paperwork, build relationships with people who will pay attention when something doesn't add up. And if the worst happens anyway, if you wake up to an accusation that couldn't possibly be true, don't try to argue your way out of it. Find people who deal in evidence and let the evidence speak. At 67, after a stroke that rewired parts of who I am and a lawsuit that tried to rewrite what I'd done, I'm still here. I walk with a slight drag in my right foot that may never fully go away. I speak more slowly than I used to, choosing words with more care than I ever bothered to before. On Sunday mornings, Cody brings the twins out, and Macy sits beside me on the porch swing, while Owen tries to find every lizard in the yard, and there's something in those mornings that feels like it cost something real to get to. People who wanted me destroyed counted on me being unable to fight back. They chose the moment when I was most vulnerable and most alone. And they were right that I was vulnerable. They were wrong about the alone part. That's the only thing I'd change about how I tell this story. Not the outcome, not the details. Just the emphasis. The medical records saved me, yes. The forensic accountant saved me. But so did my daughter sitting at my kitchen counter reading 16 pages of a lawsuit at 10 o'clock at night because her father had called her scared. So did an attorney who believed what I told her before I had a single document to back it up. So did a son who, when it finally came down to it, knew his father. That kind of thing doesn't show up in the court filings, but it's what held everything else together while the paper evidence was being assembled. You go looking for what saves you in the moments when you're most certain nothing can, and sometimes you find it's been there the whole time, in the people who show up. I keep coming back to one moment. Not the day the charges were filed, not the conference room where Shelby walked out without looking at me. But the night my daughter Ray sat across from me at my kitchen counter and read 16 pages of a lawsuit that accused her father of things he couldn't physically have done. She didn't ask me if it was true. She just read it, set it down, and started thinking about what came next. That kind of loyalty isn't something you manufacture in a crisis. It grows over decades of being the kind of person who earns it. I didn't fully understand that until I needed it. What happened to me followed a logic that I've spent a long time sitting with. Shelby didn't choose me randomly. She chose me because I had been vulnerable. Because the stroke had stripped away my defenses at exactly the right moment for someone watching for an opening. But she also chose wrong, in ways she couldn't have anticipated. Because the same life that left me lying in a hospital bed had also built the relationships and the habits that undid everything she planned. The records existed because I'd spent 31 years learning that paperwork matters. Diana believed me because I told her the truth without embellishment and let the documents do the arguing. Leigh noticed the Nashville filing because she had always paid attention to the things other people waved off. None of that was luck. It was the accumulated result of how I'd chosen to live. Quietly, carefully, honestly, showing up when I needed it most. That's the thing about character. It doesn't announce itself. It just sits there in your habits and your relationships until the day you actually need it, and then it either holds or it doesn't. I think about Bert Calloway, who spent 3 days tracking a 2-digit transposition in a social security number because that's how his mind worked. I think about Diane, who heard I was in the hospital the whole time and believed it not on faith, but because she knew how to verify. Intelligence in the way, I mean, it isn't about credentials. It's about the discipline to look closely, to resist the easier explanation, to follow the thread wherever it leads, even when it's inconvenient. That discipline is what unraveled a fraud that had been constructed over months. Emotion wouldn't have done it. Outrage wouldn't have done it. Only careful, patient thinking did. And then there's the part I find hardest to talk about. The months between getting that certified letter and the day Shelby's attorney asked for the meeting. I was 67 years old, with a stroke still working itself out of my nervous system, fighting a lawsuit while relearning how to walk steadily. There were nights I didn't sleep. There were mornings I sat in this kitchen and felt the weight of it in a way I couldn't fully describe to anyone who wasn't there. What kept me moving wasn't certainty about the outcome. It was just a refusal to stop. One phone call, one document request, one meeting at a time. That stubbornness, the willingness to stay in the fight even when staying hurts, that's the only thing I have to offer anyone going through something like this. You don't have to be certain you'd win. You just have to keep going until the truth has enough room to breathe. My right foot still drags slightly when I'm tired. My words still come slower than they used to. On Sunday mornings, Cody brings the twins and we sit on the porch. And what I feel in those hours isn't triumph. It's something quieter. Just the particular satisfaction of still being here, still being myself, after someone worked very hard to make sure I wouldn't be either.